Hey, remember when I talked about a movie I love and how I believe it effectively does everything right? Well, guess what? I can do the opposite too. Now you get to listen to me talk about a movie I despise and how I believe it does everything wrong. You get to hear me rant for an extensive amount of time. Splendid, right? Okay, let's get started. So, firstly, on the topic of adaptations. When a particular novel or series of novels becomes popular worldwide and maintains relevance for years or even decades to come, it's fairly common that eventually there will be a movie adaptation by film companies looking to capture the attention of the book's fans by reimagining the story in a new creative medium. Take Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings as the two most prominent examples. There's nothing inherently wrong about books being adapted into movies, but in my personal opinion, the adaptations almost always fail to live up to their source material, and the reason why is pretty simple. It's difficult to recapture the magic of a well-written book in a movie that can typically only be like a couple hours long at most. Novels are filled with plenty of content, lots of which has to be cut from film adaptations or at the very least limited due to time constraints. To me, it seems like this issue is why movie adaptations don't often hold up when compared to the books they're based on. That said, of all the movie adaptations I've ever watched, I still find most of them pretty good, or at least enjoyable. In fact, I'm semi-ashamed to admit this, but I even used to watch the Percy Jackson movies multiple times as a child, but yeah, that did happen, unfortunately. But my god, there is one movie adaptation in particular that genuinely hurts me, as in, the very knowledge that it exists is agonizing. The mere thought of this movie provokes unspeakable pain. Not only does it spectacularly fail at matching the quality of its source material, it's just a bad movie in general, even if you disregard the source material. In fact, scratch what I just said, it's more than bad. It's abysmal. Legitimately a violation of the Geneva Convention that probably would have started World War III back when the US and the Soviets were still butting heads. Ergo, this movie is both a horrible adaptation and simply a horrible movie. Now, the movie in question is Artemis Fowl. You may wonder why I'm making a notably long video picking apart everything I dislike about the Artemis Fowl movie adaptation, which is a lot, and to that, all I say is that I simply want to. To be honest, I don't think I need an excuse. I get a knack out of analyzing films, whether it be positive or negative, and while I'm not really a negative guy, it can be kinda fun just ranting on stuff that quite frankly deserves to be ranted on, such as this hot pile of garbage that tries to call itself a movie. Don't get me wrong, if, by some sheer stretch of logic and the fabric of existence, there are people who actually like this film, then that's perfectly okay. While I am going to try to criticize the movie semi-objectively, ultimately, it is still just my opinion if I think it sucks. So yeah, if you're a fan of Artemis Fowl the movie, don't let me stop you from being you, because your opinion is just as valid as my own. Additionally, there are a lot of videos about this film that are much better and more concise than mine, some of which I'll link in the description below. Be sure to check them out after my own, or even as an alternative if necessary. Before I talk about the movie, I do need to first explain the book for context purposes. For those who aren't familiar with the Artemis Fowl novel and series, don't worry because I was among you for most of my life until I read the first book, which was a little while before I watched the movie. It's an Irish fantasy novel by, okay, honestly, I don't know how to pronounce this guy's name, Eoin Colfer. I probably got that wrong. I'm sorry. Anyway, the novel is set in our world, but it's with a Harry Potter or Percy Jackson-esque aspect, wherein mythical creatures and beings exist without our knowledge. In the universe of Artemis Fowl, fairies, dwarves, goblins, and various other fantastical species have their own society deep underground that most humans don't know about. Emphasis on most. Anyway, the story of the first book technically has two protagonists. First, there's Holly Short, basically the fairy equivalent of a police officer who's part of LEP Recon, which is just a clever play on the word leprechaun since the universe focuses heavily on Irish mythology. She's the only female officer, at least as far as we know of in the story, so a lot of expectations have been set for her, and the main focal point of her struggle is to prove herself just as capable as her colleagues, if not more so. The other protagonist, who's actually more or less the villain of the story, is Artemis Fowl Jr., from whom the book takes its name. He is a 12-year-old human boy who also happens to be a criminal mastermind from a rich family of yet more criminal masterminds, and he's been running all the family's operations ever since his father, Artemis Fowl Sr., disappeared many years ago. Anyway, Artemis has extensive knowledge of the fantasy world hidden underground and seeks to confirm its existence and also make a ton of money in the process. So Artemis abducts Holly and tries to use her as a bargaining chip for fairy gold, so yeah, he's mostly a bad guy even if he's a child. Of course, the fairies don't take too kindly to this and launch a rescue mission attacking the Fowl Manor in a massive drawn-out battle to save Holly. All in all, it was a pretty great read with likable and interesting characters, consistent entertainment, and good world building. I do eventually intend on continuing the series. There were actually quite a few kids who grew up with these books, and while I didn't know about them, I certainly get the appeal. And now for Artemis Fowl, the movie, which basically takes everything that happens in the book, shoves it into a blender, removes a ton of stuff that made the book great, crams in random elements of later installments in the series, and creates an absolute mess of a film as a result. This quote-unquote movie, if you can even call it that, was created by Disney and released last year. This film absolutely sucks for a multitude of reasons. Before I actually get into what happens in the movie, I have to mention that it's terribly unfaithful to the original book and only loosely follows the story. The main events are still the same, but they've been altered a lot. It's actually staggering just how different it is. I'm not saying you can't take creative liberties as a filmmaker, and I'm not saying you have to be 100% accurate to your source material. What I am saying is that you need to at the very least understand what made the original good and reimagine that in a new and exciting way alongside whatever creative liberties you take. You can't just take a story and remove integral parts of it because you're worried your child audience isn't going to understand, only to replace it with nonsense which, quite ironically, ends up being even less understandable. Apparently, the movie was originally going to be more book accurate, but the main issue here was that the people in charge assumed the audience would be absolute morons. Thus, they decided they should dumb it down and destroy everything good about the story just so kids could eat it up and not question it. These Chungus brains somehow didn't realize kids actually read and enjoyed the original book. I'm fairly certain they understood it at least to the extent necessary to be entertained and not bored or confused. But who cares? Just assume they're idiots and dumb it down. Nothing could go wrong. Spoiler alert, everything went wrong. The movie starts with this really rapid and confusing news montage where various reporters talk about Artemis and his criminal schemes, before jumping to a literal MI6 interrogation facility where Mulch Diggums, a dwarf and an alleged accomplice of Artemis, is being held for questioning following his arrest. It's important to note that the British government, and most of the human world as a whole, is unaware of the existence of the mythical society. But they did still notice some unusual seismic activity surrounding Fowl Manor in Ireland, so this prompted them to question Mulch. I also need to clarify that Mulch's interrogation is happening after the main events of the film, which still somewhat follows those of the book, if only loosely, and the seismic activity MI6 noticed was caused by the battle at the manor. During the interrogation, Mulch is essentially narrating past events to the agency. I'm not sure why he does this when he could simply lie and pretend something else happened, considering telling the interrogator the truth compromises his world's safety, but he does it anyway, purely because, you know, the movie needs a narrator to explain things to the audience, since remember, the filmmakers think they're flippin' stupid. Next, we get this random opening credits montage of Artemis surfing because, you know, why not? And after that, we're properly introduced to his character in a scene where he's in counseling at school and straight up walks out because he thinks he's too good for it. We then get another montage of Artemis traveling through the woods on some weird hoverboard thingamajig because, again, why not? After that, we're introduced to his dad, Artemis Fowl Sr. Unlike in the book, Artemis Sr. is actually present in this film, not missing. In the meantime, they completely removed Artemis' mom from the story. I'll get into why it's a bad decision later. We also learn that Artemis Sr. tells his son all these fairy tale stories about the underground world. But here's the kicker. Apparently, Artemis doesn't know the stories are real. So right off the bat, the movie's establishing that this kid lacks any knowledge that the fairy world actually exists. This directly conflicts with Artemis in the book, since he's supposed to be this cunning genius who does know about the world and is eager to uncover all its dirty secrets. Instead, in the movie, Artemis is just this oblivious kid with an ego who doesn't actually believe in this stuff or have a conviction for learning more. It makes him so much less of a compelling character. Like, my god, not even 10 minutes into this movie and one of the protagonists has already been pretty much character assassinated. To make matters worse, him not knowing the fairy world is real is completely pointless because he learns about it early on in the story, and the movie then instantly treats him as if he knows everything. Because that makes perfect sense. God, this film frustrates me so much. Anyway, Artemis Sr. leaves on another one of his business trips and doesn't come back because he gets abducted. Then we're introduced to Domovoy Butler, a really tough guy who works for the Fowls. For some reason, they make his first name way more important in the movie and sort of devalue his last name, even though that's always what he was called in the book. I have no idea. I guess the filmmakers just thought Domovoy was a cool name, or they wanted to draw a parallel to Dom Toretto so Butler could come back to life through the power of family later on. Artemis wakes up and finds out through Butler and the news that his father's yacht was found abandoned. In other words, Artemis Sr. was taken hostage by someone unknown. And with this news report comes a massive logical failure on the movie's part.
The super yacht, the Owl Star, was found abandoned last night in the South China Seas.
Wait. Hold the phone. You expect me to believe that in the one night since Artemis Sr. left Ireland, he made it all the way to the South China Sea on a yacht? Does this movie have any idea how slow those boats travel? They don't go faster than 50 kilometers per hour, or 30 miles per hour for all the Americans who make up the highest percentage of my viewers. The distance between Ireland and the South China Sea is a staggering 10,610 kilometers, and even if we round that down to 10,000 for simplicity's sake and assume the yacht is going as fast as it feasibly can, it would still have taken 200 hours for it to have crossed that distance. I suppose one could argue that Artemis Sr. most likely used shortcuts like helicopters and planes and didn't take the yacht across the whole distance, but I still doubt he could have made it it all the way there in a time the movie provides, given that it seems like he's been abducted just the next morning after he left. This was a massive oversight by the writers, and sadly, far from the last. Anyway, Artemis has a hissy fit because the news reports that his dad may have been a criminal mastermind, and then the Fowl Manor gets a phone call in which a mysterious villain from the fairy world reveals that they have Artemis Sr. They say that Artemis Sr. stole a magical artifact from them and demands Artemis Jr. find it and return it to them in exchange for his father's release. By the way, the villain is named Opal Cowboy, and apparently she's in the later books as a villain, but has no part to play in the first book. It feels like they just shoved her into the movie, because after making Artemis way less of a bad guy, they needed someone to fill in the villain vacuum. She doesn't have much personality or motivation in this film, besides wanting revenge on the human world for turning her own world into silly stories. Basically a depth of a spoon type character. So Opal Cowboy gives Artemis 3 days to find the Aculos, which is the artifact Artemis Sr. stole from her, and the phone call ends. And then Artemis tells everything to Butler, who proceeds to lead him into a secret area of the manor and explain to him how all the stories his fathers told him were true. So not only is this extremely cliched, it could have simply been avoided by Artemis already knowing the truthfulness of those stories in the first place, like he did in the book. Again, the film just seems to give him all the knowledge as soon as he learns his dad was being legit, so him not knowing everything was kind of pointless to begin with. Anyway, Artemis finds his dad's journal and discovers more info, yada yada yada. Finally, we're introduced to the fairy world, and here's where another instance where the writers massively screw up appears.
And they've been living right under your feet for 1,000 years.
Only 1,000 years? Really? So the fairies were just vibing above ground with us in 1020, smack dab in the Middle Ages? Wouldn't we remember that? I assume we would remember. I could buy maybe several thousand years, but the implication here is that the fairies have been living underground for exactly 1,000 years, or at least roughly, and if they weren't living with us before, where were they? They easily could have just had Mulch say thousands of years instead of specifically 1,000. I'm sure it would have raised a lot less questions, but then again, that would have required the writers to be competent and care about the movie they're writing, so I guess it wasn't feasible. Anyhow, they get to fly by Haven City, which is basically the fairy capital. As much as I hate to give this movie credit for literally anything, I have to admit the scenery here is actually pretty cool, and the music that accompanies this scene is good too. You can tell this movie genuinely could have been good if the people behind it had given a flying hootenanny about its story, but unfortunately that revelation just makes it even more agonizing to watch. Also, the scenery stops being any good when we actually get to see the city close up, because my god is this bland. Here's where we meet the movie's version of Holly, who is bordering on Uncanny Valley with her design, since, to my knowledge, she's played by a grown adult, but is modified to look as if she's the size of a child. I'm not going to complain about that too much, because, you know, this problem was pretty much inevitable, and her design could have ended up far more unsettling in the end. Believe me, this is far from my biggest problem with Holly in this movie. I'll go more in depth about that later. We learn that the Aculos is missing, obviously, since Artemis Sr. has it. After that, we get a bunch of shots of various creatures in Haven City, including some really blatant Harry Potter goblin ripoffs. We also meet Mulch, the in-story Mulch, not the narrator Mulch. We learn he's a criminal who has a 400-year jail sentence. Jeez. And then we get this awful exchange of dialogue between him and Holly.
We're the same, you know? Your last name is short, my whole body is short.
You're not short.
That's just discriminatory.
This is legitimately some of the worst dialogue I've ever heard. It feels like it's a parody, but it was entirely genuine, and that just baffles me. The one positive thing here is that you can at least tell Josh Gad had fun playing Mulch, so good for him, I guess. We're then introduced to Briar Cudgeon, a former LEP commander who's been court-martialed and is now in jail. What for? The movie doesn't tell us. See, in the book, Cudgeon was never in jail, he was just a scumbag who tried to take over the LEP and undermine Julius Root, the current commander. This worked just fine, but for whatever reason, he was formally imprisoned and stripped from his position in this movie. But never mind that, because Opal Cowboy shows up and tells him she's convinced the people in charge of the fairy world to let him go. How? The movie doesn't explain. You can't tell me the entire committee in charge of the fairy world was convinced by this one mysterious cloaked figure with her ridiculous raspy voice to free Cudgeon. Even bribing them would have failed, because I strongly doubt every single one of them would unanimously be okay with it. It doesn't matter though, because the plot needed it to happen, so of course it does. Anyway, in exchange for getting him released, Opal Cowboy demands that Cudgeon now act as her spy in the fairy command. Gee, that sounds like a horrible idea, since the fairies would have to be idiots to welcome a known criminal back into the Oh wait, that's exactly what they do. We then jump back to Holly, and we're introduced to this movie's version of Commander Root, who's been gender bent in the adaptation. Now this in itself isn't an inherent problem, but it does contribute to a much bigger one that I'll bring up again later towards the end of the video. Root gives a speech encouraging everyone to stay on the lookout for the Aculos, and Cudgeon edges himself into the room not so subtly, which somehow only Holly notices out of everyone there. Then Holly talks to Root because apparently she has a lead on her deceased father's previous whereabouts, those being the Hill of Tara in Ireland. But Root tells her not to go. It's not exactly clear how she got this lead, the movie just acts like it makes sense and expects us to buy it. Next we meet Juliet, Butler's niece, who might as well not even be in this godforsaken film because she serves no purpose and exists purely in the background, as opposed to the book where she's a far more important character. Meanwhile, Artemis is still trying to find the Aculos and figures out he needs the help of a fairy. He believes that since he can't access their world, his best shot is a fairy who we learn periodically visits the Hill of Tara, which you'll remember is the place Holly found in a lead she had on her father. Naturally, one would believe this fairy who periodically visits to be Holly's dad, but then Artemis refers to them as a she, which makes very little sense as we know based on virtually every other mention of Beechwood that he goes by he, him pronouns and identifies as male. This fairy who visits the hill can't be Holly herself either, because the previous scene where she brought this up to Root implied the hill was a new lead Holly had just discovered. So who is this? Her mother? Someone else? The movie seems perfectly content just straight up not explaining this, so it doesn't matter. We're not even half an hour into this movie, God help me. Back in the fairy world, a troll escapes to the surface and Holly is tasked with dealing with that problem since apparently every single other LEP officer on active duty is busy looking for the Aculos. I get that this is a massive deal and all, but there wasn't even one other officer. It's not that I can't excuse Holly being assigned to go after the troll, since this happened in the book too, and there were still fairly obvious reasons to choose her, such as, you know, her being the nearest available officer, but even so, the claim that no one else could have done it whatsoever seems a bit questionable. Anyway, as Holly gets sent up to the surface, Cudgeon appears for a front row seat. Again, I have to ask why in the name of all things holy, no one has stopped to wonder why he's back on duty after being a prisoner. And he says this line.
Is this the best we can do? Send in the daughter of Beechwood Short, the traitor.
Homie, you yourself were a criminal, so those are some pretty bold words. I'm not sure what you did exactly, or if it was necessarily treason, seeing as the movie isn't keen on explaining anything, but you did break the fairy code or rulebook in some way that got you court-martialed. Seriously, just imagine someone like John Walker in this position. It's baffling how he thinks he has any sort of moral high ground, especially when at this point in the movie, Beechwood is only suspected of having stolen the Aculos. We later learn information that contradicts this, but whatever. This isn't necessarily a problem with the movie itself, I just really dislike Cudgeon. Did a single individual out of the few unlucky people who watched this movie see this and not burst into laughter immediately from how ridiculous it looked? Did anyone take it seriously? I can't stress enough how this is pretty much the only way in which the film can be enjoyed. It's unintentional hilarity by being so ridiculously stupid and poorly written, and yet even that isn't enough to counter the many negatives. Sometimes movies act stupid on purpose and that works, but with Artemis Fowl you can tell that's not the case, especially since this isn't based on a property that was written ironically either. Anyway, Holly's ejected from the pod because she was acting sus. And begins to fly over an Italian city looking for the troll. Here's where we return to Artemis and Butler, who is currently waiting at the Hill of Tara with some terrible camouflage that looks more like a Halloween costume than anything someone could actually use to disguise themselves. Anyway, Butler says that he's freezing when Artemis asks if he has anything to report, which I admit is a semi-funny line, but it makes no sense for one simple reason. In what alternate universe is the climate here particularly cold? If anything, Butler should be way warmer because of that god-awful amount of leaves he's wearing. Anyway, Holly arrives at the city where a bunch of people are partying until this awful CGI abomination of a troll that looks like it was ripped straight out of the Percy Jackson movie shows up. Instead of just bursting into the scene, however, the troll slowly walks up to the party and one girl who is consistently facing its direction sees it. Miraculously, none of these people in the background notice the troll approaching, despite the fact that they're dancing and moving around and would most certainly catch glimpses of it, even if they didn't somehow hear it. The troll literally bends over and grabs this girl without a single person so much as perking an ear to it. Even the girl's scream doesn't alert them. It's only when Holly swoops in and starts fighting the troll that the crowd of people actually notice, and that's after 2 shots of the battle, which both have no shouts in the background or any other indication that they acknowledge what was happening. I rewatched this scene a couple times and came to the conclusion that it takes these civilians a staggering 25 seconds to acknowledge the troll's presence, during which time the troll picks up a girl, causes the girl to scream, and gets attacked by Holly. This is such a massive failure of logic that I refuse to believe it was an accident. I legitimately feel as if the filmmakers noticed this problem and didn't care enough to fix it. In fact, if that were indeed the case, I don't think a single person would be shocked. Moving on, Holly saves the girl from the troll and is insistent on going against Root's orders and using her healing magic to help her because, you know, she's hurt. That said, the girl appears completely fine and looks no different after being healed. The fight goes on a little longer until a time freeze is put into effect and completely stops the motion of everything happening within a certain bubble, with the exception of the fairies. For some reason, opera music starts playing, presumably from a nearby radio, even though the time freeze should prevent that, not provoke it. I guess the movie didn't want dead silence in this scene because they assumed it would be boring, but alas, the whole movie is already a bore for the most part, so Disney probably should have tried a bit harder in that department as well. Anyway, the fairies get rid of the troll and mind wipe all the humans, but for God knows what reason, they didn't clean up all the damage and just left everyone confused as to how the party got smashed. How are these people supposed to fill in the blanks? I guess they all got drunk simultaneously. Meanwhile, instead of returning underground, Holly starts flying directly from Italy to the Hill of Tara in order to clear her father's name. As far as I remember, she does take this detour in the book as well, but it feels so much more abrupt in this movie and could have used at least a small bit of cooldown time. I mean, we just watched this battle scene with the troll. It's starting to feel like the movie went from moving incredibly slowly to moving at 1,000,000 miles per second, and that's a blatant example of awful pacing. Believe me, it just gets worse later. We cut back to Artemis, who's reading his father's journal and learns a bit more about the capabilities of the fairies and also finds some vague information about Opal Cowboy. Then, believe it or not, the film immediately cuts to Holly again. I had to question why the calm scene of Artemis reading the journal was positioned in a way that it cut a fast-paced scene of Holly flying to Ireland in half, rather than not simply placed before the scene. In fact, this could have served as a short break between the troll fight and Holly's journey to the Hill of Tara. You could simply have just had a fast-paced scene and then a calm scene to cool down before starting another fast-paced scene. But here's what you can't do. You can't have a fast-paced scene with a calm scene in the middle, slicing it in two, unless of course it's for comedic effect, which in this case, it's not. Also, I'd like to mention that Holly takes barely any time to fly all the way from the Italian peninsula to the hill. While Artemis was reading a small entry in a journal, Holly at the very least traveled across the Mediterranean Sea, the landmass of France, and the Atlantic Ocean from there to Ireland. Root only now decides to tell Holly to return after having waited for her to nearly reach her destination rather than simply from the beginning. Of course, Holly ignores her and completes her journey anyway. After she lands on the Hill of Tara, we see that Butler and Artemis are there waiting for her, hiding in the bushes. Butler being there makes sense as he's been waiting for a while now, but there's no explanation as to how Artemis magically went from Fowl Manor all the way to the Hill of Tara in a span of roughly 40 seconds, which is how much time has passed since we last saw Artemis reading his father's journal. This movie just has a habit of not understanding how time and distances work, because as I said before, the writers probably didn't care. So Artemis and Butler manage to abduct Holly after she lands. Once Root figures out she was intercepted and learns that the nearest inhabited location to the hill is Fowl Manor, she orders a full-scale attack on the manor, since I guess she knows about the fowls. Cudgeon is once again annoying, as he always is, and then we time skip to the next morning where Holly is now in a cage at Fowl Manor. She wakes up and immediately says this line.
Not happy.
I genuinely had to do a double take after hearing this. I did not believe this line of dialogue could have been real, but it was. Why would she say this? Why wouldn't she simply take in her surroundings first, and then exclaim something like, "Where am I?" or "Who did this?" Instead of being worried in the slightest, she just seems moderately annoyed. Does this happen to Holly all the time? Is this just a regular thing that fairies experience? Or is the movie just poorly written? Take your guess. The answer should be fairly clear by now. We then return to Artemis and experience a flashback where his father is explaining to him how to deal with fairies. Artemis, now knowing the truth, applies this knowledge in dealing with Holly. He and Juliet show up to talk to her, and then she understandably gets mad at Artemis, and then he just slides close the opening of the cage as if that somehow stops her from speaking and walks off, only for it to open again magically for her to say another line. It's ridiculous. By now, the fairies have begun setting up a time freeze around Fowl Manor as the first step of their rescue mission. As it's being put into place, Artemis explains how the time freeze works to Butler because, you know, he's conveniently learned everything from the journal in the short time since he uncovered it. Time freeze is put into place, except get this version of the time freeze stops everything outside the bubble rather than inside. Holy Mother of Jesus, that is a powerful tool. It's in the book too, but I still question just how much energy is needed for that, or fairy magic, or whatever they use. Anyway, Root shows up with a massive armada of fairy ships and lands at Fowl Manor, leading it to probably the only line of dialogue in this entire movie that actually got a laugh out of me.
Top of the morning.
Artemis and Butler arrive at the front of the manor to meet the fairy army, who have guns pointed at them. There's an intense moment where they all just stand still before Butler makes the first move, and thus begins the worst fight scene I've ever seen in any movie, probably ever. First, the fairies all rush at Artemis and Butler and start firing, but Butler generates a shield and deflects the blaster fire. Instead of again trying to rush at them all at once, the fairies stop in midair, abruptly change their strategy, and start buzzing around and attacking one by one, because, you know, the plot needs an excuse for Artemis and Butler not to lose. Meanwhile, the camera is jumping all over the place at light speed to the point where you can barely even tell what's happening. There's even a shot where Butler grabs the fairy and throws them to the ground, and the camera just does a barrel roll, which only serves to distract and confuse the viewer further. In the end, Butler shoots some sort of magical arrow into one of the time freeze mechanisms that ends up destabilizing it and limiting the amount of time the fairies have to rescue Holly. Somehow, the fairy soldiers just, you know, stop trying to fight it, and the battle ends, as if the time freeze stabilizer being shot meant automatic loss for them. We then return to Opal Cowboy as she monologues to Artemis Sr. about how she wants revenge on humanity for waging war on the fairies, forcing them underground, and then reducing them to silly stories. She also explains that her plans to unleash her army on Earth and wipe out all of mankind, so basically you can consider Opal Cowboy the fairy equivalent of Adolf Hitler. Meanwhile, Root meets with Artemis to negotiate, rather than, just having her troops continue to attack the manor until Artemis and Butler can't resist anymore. In the book, Artemis casts an enchantment that forces the fairies to stay outside the manor as long as she lives, but that's never established in this movie. Artemis simply tells Root they can't go inside, and she just accepts that as the truth, even though he doesn't explain why. Artemis also somehow knows the exact minute when the time freeze will stop functioning, a small tidbit of information I'm assuming he conveniently learned from the journal. Anyway, he demands the Aculos in exchange for Holly's release, and Root refuses, since, the fairies don't have it. Artemis gives her 15 minutes, and she leaves. And then she comes to the conclusion that if fairies can't enter, she needs a dwarf. And here's where Mulch comes in again. Mulch is currently in prison and for whatever reason is listening to human rock music there. I suppose he's just an enthusiast. He gets into an altercation with a bunch of elves, and at that moment, the LEP intervenes to send him into battle. And then meanwhile, back at Fowl Manor, Artemis talks to Holly again, in which we get quite possibly the stupidest moment in this entire movie.
You're enjoying all this. You think it's a game.
Game? My father was kidnapped.
My father is dead.
Can I trust you?
When I watched this for the first time, I legitimately got up from my chair, walked over to the edge of my bedroom, and banged on the wall out of frustration. If the writers genuinely thought this scene made even the slightest amount of sense, consider me baffled. You seriously expect me to believe that Artemis Fowl, the kid genius, decided to trust Holly just because she told him her father died? Just because they happen to have this one thing in common, that being the absence of a dad? And to make matters worse, Artemis removes his shades, thus exposing himself to Holly's telepathic powers because he's now abruptly decided he can trust her. He'd have to be an idiot to do this, so consider his character assassinated yet again. This isn't logical from Holly's perspective either. Why would she even want to help Artemis, who abducted her and locked her in a cage? I'm sure she felt sympathy for him because of Artemis Sr. having gone missing, but that's still not enough to justify her suddenly no longer being mad whatsoever. This massive turnaround by these two characters just feels cheap, lazy, and out of nowhere. It's like the whole Martha thing from Batman v Superman all over again. There's nothing meaningful or impactful about it. It happens because the plot needs it to happen, and because the filmmakers didn't have the balls to make Artemis an actual villain, seeing as they thought the staggering 2 children watching this film wouldn't be able to handle that. Oh my god, I can't take it anymore. I just can't. Oh, and to add insult to injury, Holly goes on to explain that her father was murdered for treason at the Hill of Tara because she had taken the Aculos and given it to Artemis Sr. in order to keep it away from Opal Cowboy. This raises so many questions. How long ago did this happen? Because it seems like it was quite a while in the past, based on how characters talk about it, but earlier on in the film, we see a news report in the fairy world that makes it seem like it was only recently that the Aculos was taken, and operations to look for it are still at large, as if it's a recent crisis. Not to mention the aforementioned news report claims that Beechwood Short is a suspect. How on earth do the fairies not know for sure if it was him, if he was already killed for having given it away ages ago? God, does this movie have any continuity to it whatsoever? We're still within the first hour. Just end my suffering! Anyway, Mulch strikes a deal with Root and agrees to help rescue Holly in exchange for a lighter prison sentence. He proceeds to tunnel into the manor in a really disgusting way that isn't at all helped by the poor CGI. Technically, this is book accurate, but it still looks bad in movie form. Mulch gets into the house, somehow arriving in a painting, because, that's obviously part of the ground. He then conveniently finds the exact place the Aculos is being stored behind, another painting of Artemis Sr. Meanwhile, Artemis frees Holly, having waited multiple scenes to do so, for whatever reason. This also kind of devalues Holly's character, seeing as in the book she got out via her own wit by manipulating Juliet, but as you can surely tell by now, this movie does not care about these characters. Then we return to Mulch, and I kid you not, he uses his hair to unlock the safe. Believe me, it needs no explanation. Once the safe's open, the Aculos is revealed, much to the shock of everyone, especially me, because I'm surprised Mulch managed to find it this easily, when Artemis, who has lived here his whole life, couldn't do so earlier in the film when he was looking for it. See, the neat thing about the Aculos was that its magic prevented it from being discovered until the plot demanded it. Pretty cool if you ask me. Once Opal Cowboy figures out the Aculos was discovered, she orders Cutchin to intervene and take command of Root's army because, apparently he has the authority to do that. Granted, he does hijack everything in the book too, but they actually explain how he does this by lobbying committee members to his side and using Root's failures to justify the command transfer. Remember, in the book, Cutchin wasn't a criminal, just a military officer with a lot of support like route, and he was never court-martialed, so it made a lot more sense how he could gain the support of the fairies in charge. The same can't be said for this movie, where it seems like Cudgeon just magically has the ability to do whatever he wants until the plot takes that away later on. So anyway, he takes command, holds Root at gunpoint, forces his troops to block all magic in the area, including Holly's, and sends the troll from earlier into the manor to smash everything, except now it's on steroids. By this point, Artemis, Butler, Holly, and Mulch are all on the same side and notice the troll about to be launched into the manor. Artemis asks what it is and Holly explains. I have to stop and question how Artemis managed to learn the exact specifics of how time freezes function from his father's journal and never once figured out what a troll was. The troll gets catapulted into the manor and launches Holly right into a chandelier, where her wings get stuck and she remains for the majority of the fight, seeing as the movie needs it to last longer than it would have otherwise. Juliet shows up again, so I guess her existence hasn't entirely been forgotten. The fight goes on for a little while before Holly is finally freed, and then the troll is crushed onto the chandelier. Butler sacrifices himself to save Artemis's life, only to be healed later by Holly's magic in typical deaf cop-out fashion. This did happen in both the book and the movie, but in the book it was honestly awesome. As far as I remember, Butler got completely shredded by the troll and then healed, before putting on a suit of armor and epically murdering the troll with a mace. In the movie, he just got hurt by the troll falling on him. That's a bit underwhelming in comparison, if I have to admit. We get this whole emotional scene where Butler talks to Artemis on his deathbed, even though he doesn't actually die. Of course, the fairies conveniently decide to go against Cudgeon at the exact moment this is happening and unblock the magic in the manor, allowing Holly to save Butler's life. Good job, Disney, having a generic fake-out death scene no one can take seriously. Major props to you. Not. The movie then jumps right back to 100 as the time freeze is collapsing and reality itself is breaking around the manor. The fairies evacuate and eventually it just explodes and resets to normal. Now that the battle is officially over, Artemis gets Holly to help bring back Artemis Sr. using the magic of the Aculos. Conveniently at the exact time Opal Cowboy is about to kill him. The movie does another generic trope where the characters think it didn't work, but then they find out it did. Artemis and his dad reunite and then he meets Holly and tells her how her father was a hero for giving the Aculos to the Fowls for its protection. He also gives her a list of Opal Cowboy's accomplices of whom her father was investigating. Holly then transports herself back to the fairy world with the Aculos, presumably so she can give it back to the fairies, even though that sort of defeats the entire purpose of why Artemis Sr. was provided it in the first place. But whatever, I'm giving up trying to understand this movie. Back underground, the Aculos is secured, and Root assigns Holly to investigate Opal's accomplices, teasing a potential sequel that I'm sure will be coming out promptly due to the massive success of this movie. We return to Fowl Manor where Artemis and his dad spend some more time catching up, and then Artemis calls Opal purely to tell her that she got epically trolled, and that she's about to be even more epically trolled. And then we get another god-awful line of dialogue that reeks of a total lack of creativity.
Who do you think you are?
I'm Artemis Fowl. And I'm a criminal mastermind.
I don't even know what to say about this. It's just bad. Plain bad. We then get this slow shot of Artemis walking in his suit and shades as if he's a child version of Neo from The Matrix, before he hops into a helicopter with his dad and some unknown pilot. For whatever reason, Artemis Sr. is sitting in the back, while Artemis Jr. is sitting next to the pilot, because, you know, that makes perfect sense. Always put your children in the front seat, everyone! We then cut back to the MI6 interrogation facility, where Mulch has finally finished up his tale. Unsurprisingly, the interrogator doesn't believe the story he just told them. And then Mulch drops a bombshell that Artemis set up his arrest. And then he does the stupidest thing ever. He reveals his magical powers right in front of the camera. Look at you, Mulch, the absolute genius, compromising your entire world by revealing yourself to be a mythical being in front of the British government. They'll have no explanation for what they just saw, and they'll have to assume that your story was true, which means now the UK will be investigating it, which means you put basically everyone you care about in danger. The whole point here is that the Fowls and their allies are trying to keep the peace by having the two realms stay separate. So why would Mulch do this? Why wouldn't you just wait a little longer, seeing as the Fowls' helicopter from before shows up and somehow breaks him out of this highly secure MI6 facility, which shouldn't be possible in and of itself. This scene is beyond idiotic on multiple levels, and I've just about had it. This movie has pushed me to my absolute limit. I cannot fathom just how ridiculously and poorly written this is. It is legitimately an insult to anyone who watches it, especially fans of the book and its series. I just can't. Thankfully, that's it. The helicopter flies off into the distance with Mulch, and the movie ends. Thank the Lord, my agony has finally subsided. So now that I've gone through the events of this movie, I'm going to summarize why I think it sucks as a whole. The logical errors, plot holes, and everything else I have already mentioned would be enough to bring down any film, but I feel like coming up with a proper conclusion and putting forth some proper arguments along with it might be a better idea. As such, here's the basics on why Artemis Fowl the movie is a horrible adaptation and overall nothing more than a garbage film. Surprisingly, there are a few minuscule positive things I can say about this movie, but I can list off those things in a very short amount of time. The music is alright, the scenery isn't that bad, and some of the dialogue is just barely tolerable, despite a lot of it being cliched at best and downright awful at worst. Oh, and the top of the morning joke was pretty funny. That's it. That's really all I can say about this film that isn't negative. As far as acting goes, Josh Gad seems like he enjoyed playing Mulch, so again, good for him. Also, Colin Farrell was alright as Artemis Sr. Everyone else just seemed largely unenthused, and they very clearly were not on their A-game. I can't even blame any of the actors for their shoddy performances, since if I was in their position, I wouldn't care enough to act well either, even if I could. Words cannot describe my pity for Ferdia Shaw in particular, because I can't see him making much of a name for himself in the future considering his acting debut was as the main character of this abomination. Like, I genuinely feel bad for him, and I hope he can have a fulfilling career after all. The pacing in this movie is also god-awful, as most of it is painfully slow, but at some points it abruptly goes all the way up to light speed to the point where it simply disorients the viewer. A consistently slow-paced film can work, and a consistently fast-paced film can work as well, but flip-flopping between both on multiple occasions is a terrible decision. There's instances where I could barely tell what was happening as things were moving way too fast, way too abruptly. Besides that, the film was very slow and consistently unentertaining, with the exception of the ironically enjoyable parts, that is. If you want some context on just how badly paced I think this movie is, consider the following. I think it's worse than The Rise of Skywalker in that regard. That should give you a pretty good idea of just how terrible the pacing is. Now we get into some of the most glaring issues of the movie, starting with the problems caused by its lack of faithfulness to its source material. Again, I have to clarify this. I do not believe creative liberties are inherently bad. In fact, I strongly believe the opposite. I think taking creative liberties is usually more beneficial than detrimental. However, when adapting a book into a movie, I'm of the opinion that your changes need to have valid justification and need to positively affect the narrative. If you can do something better in the movie, then by all means, do it. However, there is nothing, and I repeat, nothing that the Artemis Fowl movie does better narratively than the first book of which it mainly takes inspiration from. If I had to go over every single instance of this problem, this would quickly turn into a Mahler video, so I'm just going to explain the most important ones. First of all, Artemis' character. The handling of Artemis in this movie was absolutely abysmal, and that's probably one of the things that ticks me off more than anything else. I really enjoyed him in the book. I thought he was excellent. The idea of a 12-year-old boy being a genius criminal mastermind was just a really fun and interesting concept to me, especially because he was also sinister. He had an egotistical, yet endearing and charismatic personality and worked excellently as the villain of the story. He wasn't entirely evil, showing signs of sympathy and a good heart here and there, but he was still clearly an antagonist, especially to Holly. But here, in this movie, well, none of that applies. The movie didn't want Artemis to be the villain. They wanted him to be the good guy. Even though he still abducts Holly, he doesn't even do that just to demand money from the fairies like he did in the book. He's doing it because his father was abducted first and he needs Holly's help. From his perspective, or even from the audience's perspective, he's not morally in the wrong, at least not that much. The de-villainification problem applies to the Fowl family as a whole, too. In the book, the Fowls are clearly rich people who steal for their own gain, instead of being given magical artifacts to protect them from the forces of evil. I'm not saying morally good characters aren't as interesting as villainous characters, but in the context of the Fowls, particularly Artemis, making the family morally good in this movie killed off everything that made any of them interesting in the book. In order to fill in the vacuum, the movie crudely inserted Opal Cowboy and made her the villain, which failed miserably due to her, not being interesting whatsoever. There's more problems with Artemis' character, of course. You're probably tired of me saying this by now, but making him unaware of the existence of the fairy world was a very stupid decision, especially since he learns about it later and becomes pretty much an expert as soon as he does. I get that he was told many things by his father under the guise of them being myths, but him jumping from oblivious to knowing everything still feels stupid and unnatural. Another issue entirely concerns Artemis' parents. I don't mind that they made Artemis Sr. present in this movie, but the fact that they removed Artemis' mother is what gets me. She was an important character in the book, helping to establish that as much of a criminal mastermind Artemis was, he was still a child who felt emotions. Instead, she's dead in this movie, and never comes up again after the school therapy scene. It's such a pointless and disastrous change. Not only does it add nothing, it takes away so much character potential for Artemis. It would be okay to have both his parents be present, but they should have either done that or stayed faithful to the book and had his mother be the one there with his father still missing. And now we move on to Holly. You'll remember I mentioned a major problem I had with her character that I'd bring up again later. Well, now I'm going to bring it up. This is a bit of a serious subject, and while I typically try to avoid those in my videos, I have to address this because it relates to the awfulness of this movie. Like I said way back at the beginning of the video, Holly was a female LEP officer within an entirely male environment in the book. As such, she had to persevere for the challenges of sexism and discrimination in order to prove herself a capable officer. In my opinion, this was done well in the book and established Holly as a strong female character. I would certainly guess that a lot of young girls read the book and looked up to her, and that she was a role model to them. Seeing as Disney is apparently focused on being progressive nowadays, you may be wondering how they decided to reimagine such an inspiring story of a woman overcoming the challenges of a predominantly male environment and proving herself. Well, guess what? They didn't. They completely invalidated it. Remember when I said Commander Root was gender-bent? Well, so was a good portion of the LEP. In the movie, there are now plenty of female officers, just as many as male officers for that matter. In most other scenarios, I would not care about this. but in the book, there was a valid reason for the LEP being predominantly male, and that was to pose challenges for Holly to overcome. She doesn't have to persevere through sexism and discrimination if it never comes up as a problem for her to face. It was a massive part of her character in the book, and never once is it brought up in the movie. Of course, the writers still need something for Holly to overcome, so of course they make her dad a criminal just so everyone else has a reason to scrutinize or doubt her. This isn't done well at all, and is simply far less impactful than her struggle in the book. Who's going to relate to this version of Holly? Who's going to look up to her? Who is she going to inspire? The sad irony of the situation is that while Disney most likely wanted to be progressive by including more female representation in the movie, they inadvertently ended up harming the empowerment of women within the story as a whole by devaluing Holly and her struggles. As an avid progressive myself, I believe the end result here was a massive disappointment and yet another example of Disney's screw-ups. Like many times before, they tried to do good, but due to either incompetence or a lack of genuine care, they did far more harm. It's a pattern I see time and time again with major corporations, and it's a problem I unfortunately can't see stopping anytime in the near future. Anyway, between the complete destruction of Artemis's character and a devaluing of Holly's, that's already more than enough to make the film a bad adaptation. To make matters worse though, the supporting cast isn't interesting either, and there's no reason to care about anyone. The audience simply doesn't have the time to connect to anyone as opposed to the case with the book. Not enough of the movie is spent world building or character building. Most of it is just plot moving along, if you can even call it a plot. I know it's only an hour and a half, but I don't think it would have killed the filmmakers to increase the length and fit in more content of actual value. Not to mention a lot of the movie's already short runtime is wasted on pointless nonsense anyway. To be honest, if they somehow formatted it correctly, I think an Artemis Fowl TV series would have been a better idea than a movie. It could have spent a lot more time building the world and its characters, and there would have been a while for them to develop as the story progressed. However, as much as I talk about what could have been, that doesn't change the fact that what we got is a poorly written mess, riddled with plot holes, leaps in logic, undeveloped and boring characters, terrible story alterations, subpar acting, awful pacing, and shockingly underwhelming visuals for a company like Disney. Even if you disregard the original book and pretend this movie isn't an adaptation, it's still an abysmal movie nonetheless. At this point, I'm not really sure what else there is to say here. I'm certain there's many points I could still make, but I can't be bothered to keep going on about this movie. In conclusion, the Artemis Fowl movie sucks as an adaptation, and it sucks as a film. It's an absolute travesty and an insult to fans of the book. As a Percy Jackson kid, I extend my sympathy to all the Artemis Fowl kids whose lives were ruined by the existence of this abomination. I extend my sympathy to anyone who sent themselves directly to a hospital by watching it. I extend my sympathy to you, my viewers, for making you all aware of this film and causing you to be forever scarred. No one deserves to suffer by knowing the Artemis Fowl movie is real, but alas, we live in a world where it exists. From the bottom of my heart, screw this movie.
Will that be all, Thaddeus?
That will be all, Solomon.